Okay, we are live with the Q2 podcast sponsored by Panvisio. I'm here with our guest, Dr. Terrell Strayhorn of Do Good Work LLC. And I love his LinkedIn profile description is, was it professor, public speaker, and also provocateur. I mean, that's a great summary to start it off with. So thanks so much for joining us and taking the time for the show.
Thanks for having me.
So to jump right into it, to give people context, we met at the Tri-State Consortium conference not too long ago, and we sat down and did a quick interview. And I was interested in having our audience members kind of get a taste of you tore the house down. I mean, there was even people like just with the stories that you're telling about the importance of your grandmother, just tears, and just it was really meaningful and it had an amazing impact. What brought you into higher ed to also make that sidestep shift to do what you do with public speaking consulting? Because I'm really fascinated by the side hustle and the other callings that people have with what they do from their day jobs and the transitions to other areas of life.
So I think there are, I tend to say that I was fortunate. I see myself as one who's been really blessed and fortunate to have all of my various involvements sort of come together and intersect in a way that has come to really represent and be my life's purpose, my life's focus. But it's not like I ever knew that or could have anticipated it, and certainly wouldn't take credit for designing it that way. After completing my master's degree, I was working for the Council of Graduate Schools in Washington, D.C. as a research associate. I remember loving that job just because it was my first job out of graduate school, and I was in D.C., so that was great. But there were all these projects that started to emerge. At the time, one of the priorities of the Council of Graduate Schools was around doctoral completion and diversity in graduate programs. And although I had a sort of natural interest in it, I wasn't ever really invited or thought of for coming to those meetings. And I remember asking someone on the team, like, hey, I'm wondering why in the world I can't ever come to these meetings, or why, how can I get my hands on this? And one of the staff members at the time, she was a scholar in residence. Her name was, or is, Anne Pruitt Logan. And I might come back to that because it's another illustration of something that I've come to really believe, and that is that life is really connected in ways that you can't really imagine. So Anne told me, you're not invited in those meetings because you don't have a doctorate. And I thought, oh, well, where do you get one of those? And so then it wasn't too long after that I decided to resign from my position, or actually I didn't resign from that position. It wasn't too long after that I ended up applying to doctoral programs. And so all that to say, I was in this job at the Council of Graduate Schools, working and doing research, but wasn't really meaningfully involved in some of the most interesting projects at the time. The Council of Graduate Schools downsized. I was one of the first sort of batch of people who received a severance package to downsize the team, and then I ultimately ended up teaching in a public school and then going back to get my doctorate. Well, after working on my doctorate for a few years, it was time to think about my dissertation, and without even drawing the dot back to the Council of Graduate Schools, through consultation with my advisor and other professors, they helped me understand that my sort of natural, my predominant interest at that time had been student success and issues of equity and diversity and ways in which we can enable student success. And they helped me really understand that the literature was quite full with studies on undergraduate students and pushed me to think about graduate students. So I started thinking about graduate education, graduate student persistence, graduate student success. That became the site of my doctoral dissertation. But it wasn't until I was working on the dissertation I realized, oh my gosh, I used to work at the Council of Graduate Schools. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, my assistantship was in the graduate school. I worked for the graduate dean. So all of these symmetries came together in ways that people outside the situation probably thought I designed or was intentional. And in many ways it was not. It was serendipitous. I became a professor. I started my career at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, stayed there 5 years on the faculty, and then was recruited and went to the Ohio State University. I was there for 7 years. Well, as I started evolving in my research and my writing, I became more and more convinced and passionate about converting or translating my research into practice. And one way to do that was to through public talks, where I engage practitioners and professors and students in these big questions that relate to my areas of expertise in terms of research. And I know there are a couple questions later that I could sort of expand upon this, but to your point about how they all came together in purpose, all I can tell you is I started doing what I loved, research, and I was able to, as a professor, investigate the questions that were really important to, at least in my opinion, for the field, for groups that I cared about and I think we needed to pay attention to. And then I started trying to get the research in the hands of people who have my heart, and that is not just policymakers and journal editors, but everyday people like grandmas and aunties and uncles and teachers and mentors and pastors and students themselves. And while doing that, I had times where I realized, wow, what works in the academy doesn't work in the classroom. What works in the academy doesn't really work well in the living room. It doesn't work well in the church. The style, the rhythm, the presentation style has to be different. So the way I tell the story is I remember being at a conference in Atlanta, speaking about student success from my research. The title of my talk had something to do with, students being able to fly or soar with our assistance. And I did my best talking about my research. I did my best to highlight these practical implications. The only thing that I thought would take this session from like good to great would be if I knew R. Kelly at the time, to come in and sing I Believe I Could Fly, or two, if I had thought about it and queued up my PowerPoint so that the last slide, the song starts blaring over the speakers. And I don't know him, and I didn't cue my PowerPoint. So as I'm approaching the last slide and I can feel the energy in the room and people seem to want more, and I'm like, come on, we gotta, I'm a music major, we gotta crescendo up to our climax and be done with this. I remembered that I'm a singer. And so as I'm anticipating this last slide, which really ends with, okay, that's the end, are there any questions? I grab a chair, I stand on it, because I'm a short guy, so I needed some height to do this. And I just start singing to my best of my ability, I Believe I Can Fly. And I lost myself for about a minute in the song, because the energy of the song, the words, the passion I feel about the work all came together in a way I had not anticipated. And then when I stopped, I opened my eyes and everyone is standing and they're clapping and there are people crying. And literally at the end of that session, which I had given, I don't know, maybe 36 talks by then in my career, a woman came up to me and said, would you come to our campus and do exactly what you did today? And for a lot of people, when I say that, or I'll say that differently, when people ask me, when did I get into public speaking? For me, that was the birth of it. The public speaking part. It was more than just an academic talk about my research. It was sort of the intersection of all of my identities as a researcher, as a scholar, as a man of faith, as a singer, a musician. And since then, I've tried to perfect that science and art. And at one point I thought this is fun, and it is fun. But most recently, I'd say in the past 1 to 2 years, I spent a lot of time really accepting that this is actually more than fun. It is purpose. It's my why. That doesn't mean, I don't cringe when people say, are you a public speaker? Are you a performer? There is a performative aspect to what I do, especially when I get into the public dissemination of my research. Behind, closed doors in front of computers, I'm a scientist, a social scientist who's striving to do rigorous research. But when it comes to that public engagement piece, I'm not offended by that, but I actually think it's more than just a public speaker or more than just a performer. It's purpose for me, and it's really, I used to tell my grad students, I saw myself as an academic entrepreneur. And to that point, you started talking about like the various side gigs and hustles that people have. I saw that language before I ever saw and fully understood what it meant for me.
Wow, I love that, academic entrepreneur. I think we both had that similar take, where it's like you just started you did it as a service, as part of your job, as part of your research. For me, it was more so part of my job than research, but it really came into that. I think you saw that opening, people saw that opening, and they really wanted to go there. So when it comes to the state of higher ed now, you're seeing it from a scholar, from a researcher, from a professor, all these different angles, and even as someone who goes around empowering others through your talks, what are some of the things that you're happy about in 2018 in higher ed, and some of the things that we're still dropping the ball? I mean, I have some pet peeves with higher ed, and there's some things that obviously they're doing right, and we can always improve, but are we behind? Is higher ed behind, given the research that we know? Are we still not getting something?
I think that there are a lot of ways in which you could answer that question about higher education. Certainly, there's no denying, even as we can be fairly critical of higher education and where it is at this point in time, there's no denying the tremendous progress that we've witnessed in this country. I mean, we have and have had for a long period of time, even despite some slippage in our global competitiveness with other countries in terms of higher education and research and development. We have had and still have one of the largest, most comprehensive and high quality higher education or post-secondary education systems in the world. We have, over 21 million college students in the United States who are enrolled across 4,300 colleges and universities. It wasn't until I started, doing some international research, but also going to international conferences and sharing U.S. research with others, that I really came to appreciate the fact that, in this world, we have some countries that only have 1, 2, 3 universities. We have over 4,300 of them. We haven't always had that many. Of course, the growth of two-year community colleges at the turn of this 19th century and so forth, as well as the establishment of a lot of for-profit institutions and minority-serving institutions, helps us have this tremendous capacity to educate post-secondary learners that is unparalleled and unmatched by any country in the world. So that's a sign of tremendous progress. We have not only lots of students at lots of institutions, we have increased diversity. We need to do more, but we certainly have more women than ever before. In fact, women outnumber men on most college campuses. We have more ethnic minorities than ever before: African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, biracial, mixed race, more immigrant or undocumented students living with disability. And we also, it's not just numerical representation. Like, we have a lot of students and we have a lot more of these subgroups. We also have greater understanding. Well, let's not go to understanding yet. We have at least greater awareness and some visibility of all of these groups. So we know that we have students in higher education who are living with disabilities. We know that we have veterans who return to higher education and who are currently enrolled in our institutions. We have single parents. We have foster youth. There are, over 400,000 foster youth in the country. and every year about 21,000 of them age out of the system. Upon aging out, about 87% of them say, I need something like higher education, a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree in order for me to achieve independent adult living. But still today, less than 9% of foster youth ever earn a college degree. So we know that there are foster youth who come to college. Now, I think the part that I said about understanding match with awareness is I think we need to do a better job of getting a sense of not only the fact that they exist in the system, but where are they located? Where are they concentrated? Because I've worked at and given public lectures or consulted with campuses that believe they have no students in a certain group, whether it be foster youth or students who are not just low income, but no income at all. Campuses that believe, we know that there are formerly incarcerated adults or juvenile involved youth who go to college, but they're not here at our campus. And the numbers just don't seem to suggest that. It actually is the case that probably most campuses have students in all these groups. I think we need greater awareness of the presence of students on campus, and then a deeper, far deeper understanding of what their experiences are. That to me is what intersectionality and intersectional studies really does for us. It lets us understand that, the idea of, what do we know about Black students? What do we know about Latino students? What do we know about LGBTQ students? Is just the beginning of the iceberg for understanding the experience of these students, because their experiences are nuanced. They're shaped by race, class, and gender in ways that we had not previously imagined. So we need a deeper, more nuanced, complex understanding of the student experience. That's the kind of research I see myself engaged in these days. And then secondly, I think we have spent a lot of time talking about what I just talked about, and that is the presence of students on campus. We know that they exist. We kind of have a sense of their numbers. We might know where they're concentrated or enrolled, but we focus a lot on access, just getting them to college. And I think we really need to shore up, strengthen, deepen, make more sophisticated all of our efforts in terms of student success. Like, how do we make sure that not only do we get them to the door, but through the door and to their degree? As I say in public talks all the time, the purpose of going to college is not to get through the door and to get the coffee mug and the t-shirt and the baseball cap, or to get cool paraphernalia, or to even go through one semester. Most people enroll with a desire to achieve a certificate, an associate's, a bachelor's, or some advanced degree. And so much of what we do in higher education, this is the part you're talking about in terms of, the most serious critique I could raise about higher education is that we're pretty short-sighted in most of our planning around students' enrollment and success. It's always about how can we get some group of students from over here to our campus, and then once they're there,
go through the motions.
We lose sight of them. We leave it up to them. We'll go I've worked at campuses, I've consulted with campuses that will spend lots of resources, not all the time money, but sometimes, but human resources, fiscal resources, to build bridge programs for students, to create pre-college outreach programs, to send advisors into the high school, to send messages to their homes, their schools, put flyers on the wall. They do all this stuff that says, hey, notice our school and come here. But then once they get there, not only are our strategies pretty short-sighted, but I think if you could dig a little deeper, what it actually reveals is that there's a shift in our mindset, our philosophy, once they enter, that is so problematic for student success. And that is, before they come, we see ourselves as fisher people, fishermen, fisherwomen. We got to go get them and bring them here. But once they're here, subtly, our mindset and philosophy changes to, now it's up to them to be successful. We have the libraries, we have the writing center, we have advising services. They're available, but rather than see ourselves as still trying to cultivate and nurture, advise, and guide students to and through their degree, we leave them at their sort of welcoming door, and say, okay, here's the campus, here's all we provide, now make use of it on your own. And that's just not, it's not really done much for us. That's why I think our success rates are so low for students in this country. I've, had a lot of epiphanies in my research that helped me understand that higher education is a culture, has its own language, has its own set of rules. It's organized in ways that, I think you were saying earlier, I mean, people can probably tell I'm at home, and it's snowing here in Nashville. And so I'm at home. I know where stuff is in my house. Higher education is not set up like this. I set up my home. I put my forks in that drawer, and I put my coffee mugs in that cabinet. So I know when I want a coffee mug where to go to. I didn't design the campus. Students don't design our campuses, so they don't know exactly where to go when they need tutoring. And I pick on tutoring because I've had a lot of intel from students in interviews and surveys where they've shared things like, in high school, my guidance counselor was the go-to person for everything.
Hub. It's an information hub of all kinds of things,
One-stop shop, But when I got to X campus, well, not only do I not know where to go for tutoring, but I realized there's tutoring available through the Summer Bridge program. There's tutoring available where we met through many of the opportunity programs and the TRIO programs. There's tutoring available in my major department. There's tutoring available sometimes through the cultural centers on campus. Not to mention, as I said earlier, higher education to culture has its own language, and that language is privileged language when we really start to look at it.
Go ahead.
Through an appropriate gaze. So we call folks mentor, advisor, peer mentor, faculty advisor, academic advisor. Before you know it, a student is confused. No one has those titles when they're back home, especially not first generation students or low income, no income, foster youth. So I think what we need is to have more appropriate philosophies about students and their success that inform our decision making and our strategic planning and our enrollment management plans, so that we think about access and success. Access without success is useless. But we also start to do what I think I call a sort of cultural excavation of sorts, where we look at our institution and say, where are the hangups? What's the privileged language? And how can we decode and declassify some of this so that students can be more successful? And I've worked with some campuses, and I'll just give you a couple examples and stop. Campuses have worked on using different techniques where you get everyone in the room who might have contact with first-year incoming students, and you ask them, what are the messages that you're sending to students in that first semester, first year? And you can do this with Post-it notes, get everyone to write it down on Post-it notes and put it on the wall. And you start to realize, like one 4-year public university in a Midwestern state did, and that is that the average incoming first-year student at that campus received over something like 300 messages from, I don't know, maybe 50 different offices on campus in that first semester. Well, that's overwhelming. And a student can't not only manage that much incoming information, but when it's coming from so many different sources, you are easily confused about where to go when you need help. What they were able to do through this sort of process mapping technique was to figure out, one, how many of these messages are essential? Which ones are non-essential? What's the appropriate timing for these messages? Can some of these messages be combined so there's one message sent to the student from multiple offices? Can we cluster some of this so that it's not every single office sending their own message, but much like you were saying, back to the high school way of life, one-stop shop or go-to point for students to get support? Well, already we're starting to realize and witness some of the success and the increase in success rates for that campus when they started to make these tough decisions about how to reach out to students and really help them wade through all of the information that they need to be successful. And then finally, I've met students who say things like, takes them a semester to know what a syllabus is. Takes them a long time to know
Bingo.
Credit hours. How do you calculate a GPA? What is the difference between a mentor, an advisor, a peer mentor, a faculty
success
advisor?
Coach is another one.
Success coach, an academic advisor. And so what we've done is work with some campuses to put on, I'm going to say paper, but in this case it was on technology, a computer, all of those classifications, and then to have clarity around their roles, which revealed to the campus that there's some overlap and duplication of effort.
Uh-oh.
And then to make tough decisions about, okay, so now the success coach will only do this, and that leaves the academic advisor to do this. And then once we had all of this mapped out, we were able to develop a tool which looks much like a logic tree. So imagine a student receives this high colored glossy image, or what'd you say?
Like a chart?
Yeah, like a chart that says, if you need academic advising, or if you need to select courses, then you might go to, and it gives you two branches. You might go to your academic advisor, you might go to this person. You go to your academic advisor if you're trying to register for classes, you have a block on your account, blah, blah, blah. You go to this person if you're just thinking about what courses you want to take in the future, and have no intentions of enrolling in the next sort of semester or so forth. And before you know it, we were able to create a useful tool that starts to break down some of the cultural barriers to student success. We miss them in higher education. We don't think about it this way, but in many ways, our values are reflected in the words that we assign to these roles. Success coach. Well, that's interesting because most success coaches are there to help students ultimately get good grades and graduate. But if you ask students, what's success for you? I did this once in Oklahoma, and I met a first-generation Latina architect major who told me that success for her is not about her job. It's not about how much money she makes. It really is not about the degree at all. It's about acquiring the skills so she can ultimately go back home and do two things. One, convince her father that college was worth it for her because she's breaking all sorts of cultural norms in her family for her to go away to college. And then secondly, for her to build for her mother the kitchen that her mother rightfully deserves because she said her mom's a great cook. Well, success coaches don't think about success that way. So, I mean, when we say success coaches or mentors, we usually are embedded in that classification are the values of higher education. We need to appreciate that sometimes our values, our goals, what we desire for students is not what they desire for themselves, and have a cross-cultural conversation that really is student-centered and success-centered so we can ultimately make sure that students are convinced and supported to be successful in higher education.
Well, a lot of what you said goes back to a lot of your writing, especially most recently with the research of belonging.
Yep.
And that's a great segue because a lot of that work is towards, on the surface it might not even look like that or seem like that, but those tough decisions goes back to having the students feel that they can attach themselves to something and know they're on the right track. And that sense of confidence kind of like builds over time, and then next thing you know, you see the self-agency that we've been complaining about for all these years that they don't know. They need to read they see like kind of like just grow organically for them. Here's the thing: you said higher ed has their own language and has been designed. They've inherited this culture. What has been some of the biggest challenges that you've seen working with staff and faculty when in the area of leadership and organizational development that's kind of been the biggest hang up for them? Because it's, if you tell fish like they're in water, like they don't know, but you have to name it first. They just assume that things are just as they are for a reason and just kind of navigate through their day in, day out. What's been the biggest hang up is to name these issues that help with student belonging, and any tips that you've seen work where faculty and staff who might have been a little more, I would just say hard-headed to come around, has clicked for them from what you've seen?
Yeah. So, I mean, so much of what you just shared, like you said, connects so well to what we've been talking about, as well as the research that I've been doing on belonging. And I just finished the second edition to the Belonging book, which comes out later this spring. And I'm excited about the second edition. it was a labor of love in the sense that, you know, I had a lot more I wanted to say about belonging, although I didn't realize it until about 2 years ago when, you know, when I wrote the belonging book, I thought it was, and I don't mean it in a dismissive way, but I thought it was my, you know, another book. And I tell the story all the time that when I wrote the book, I actually wasn't writing a book about belonging at first. I finished a book in 2010 called The Evolving Challenges of Black College Students. And it's all about African American and Black students in college. There are chapters on cultural centers, there are chapters on Black men in college, the role of spirituality in the life of Black students. And so that book was out for about 2 years, and I thought I have a lot more I want to say about Black students. And the 2010 book was an edited volume, so it had other authors in the book. I was the editor of the book. But in 2012, I thought, I have enough I want to say about African American and Black students that I think I'm going to do a sole authored book on them. And so I started writing this book. But by this time, I had started studying Latino students. I was studying gay students. I was studying low income, first generation, and students in different settings. I'd already done work on graduate students. And so while I'm writing this book on Black students, I start talking about Black students who are low income. And before you know it, low income becomes the focus, right? And now I'm talking about low income students and calling out an interview with a Black low income student who was also in a fraternity or sorority. And now clubs and involvement, fraternities and sorority become the focus. And at some point I thought, oh my gosh, I'm lost in this book. This book is like, at one moment it's about Black students, at one moment it's like low income students, at another moment it's about fraternity and sororities. So I ended up having a conversation with my publisher and saying, I thought this book was about Black students, but it's really about a lot of different kinds of groups. And I'm having a hard time really focusing on a particular group. And so she started asking me questions like, well, are there common themes? And I said, well, there are themes like community, support, sense of care, seeing one's self reflected in the environment, visibility. And before you know it, she said, well, why don't you try writing the book around those themes and see if there's language or a way to connect them. Well, I did. I sort of flipped the chapters. Instead of starting about the persons, I started with the themes. And before you know it, I had this wonderful refrain about connectedness and feeling cared about and valued and visible. And as I started looking at the words, they suggested to me this sense of mattering and belonging. And that drove me into the literature, and I realized, oh wow, there's a whole literature in K-12 education about school belonging from which I can draw ideas for higher education belonging. So that was the impetus and the origin of that book. And so I wrote the book. I was happy when it came out, and then as it started circulating and people started using it in classes and in workshops and so forth, that's when even more opportunities came to engage the public around that work. Because, you know, sort of moving now into the pieces that you've asked about here, I think one thing's very clear. I say I wrote it in 2012, but I knew it by 2014, and that is belonging really does matter. Everybody wants to belong. I was on the plane, 2 days ago, sitting beside a woman who I did not know, and she just starts talking to me about, feeling really grumpy about life, and and you can't hear that and not ask questions. So I'm trying to.
It's funny how those conversations find you too.
Yeah,
right? It's like you're on a plane, you're trying to rest.
While you have headphones on, of course.
Yeah.
So I have my headphones on, and I have my leave me alone glasses on, sunglasses on, but it doesn't work all the time. And so she starts talking, and my guess is she needed it. And so as I'm listening to her, I started probing, like, are you able to identify the source of your pain or the source of your frustration? And she says, yeah. She starts naming it, and she says, she doesn't feel, right? Mm-hmm. She doesn't feel like her husband or her partner understands. She right now is living with a health condition, and There are things that she cannot do that she used to be able to do. And she feels that her partner gets frustrated with her because she can't do these things. And, says things like, oh, just grin and bear it. When in fact, because of the pain, she really cannot do it. In fact, she's on the plane with me because she's terminated a work trip, prematurely to get back home because she's in such condition. Well, ultimately, she's saying she doesn't feel cared about. She doesn't feel like she matters. Then she starts talking about her children who, when she was really going through her rough spot, didn't come to visit her in the hospital. Well, you take all of these pieces of these stories together and they map beautifully onto a sense of belonging framework. Everybody wants to feel like someone cares about them and thinks about them and cares about their health and success. Well, when applied to an educational context, the same is true for students. What I think the book and the research and what I see myself trying to do in this this work is to persuade the masses, including the faculty and staff that you said can sometimes be convinced about
the degree matters, the process matters, my curriculum matters.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there are faculty and staff who, one, believe that other things matter more.
Yes.
I think there are faculty and staff who, mostly faculty in this case, I think, and I love my faculty colleagues dearly, but I found way more of this kind of resistance amongst faculty than, say, staff like student affairs administrators and those who work in some of the support services office, the TRIO officers. But faculty, especially those in some of the disciplines, make these false dichotomies between what they call the hard stuff, the curriculum, the laboratories, the internships, the co-ops, and then this soft stuff called belonging. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, I think my battle is at least twofold. That is, first, to convince everyone, students included, that belonging does matter, and that it is, as the book says, it's the missing ingredient in the sweet in the sauce for success. If you want to be successful, I think in life, certainly in college, part of it is we need to make sure that students feel a sense of belonging, and that students who feel a sense of belonging succeed, they thrive, they graduate, they become lifelong devoted alumni of the institution. In fact, I was in New Jersey one time giving a public talk, and at the end I gave a poll and said, how many of you in here felt like you belonged in college? And half the hands went up. I said, keep your hands up if you have ever written a check to your institution, gone back to a game or some event, but you would call yourself an engaged alum. Most hands stayed raised. Put those hands down. How many of you in here have never felt like you? In fact, you don't even know why you graduated from the institution, because you felt like you didn't belong, you were so alienated, and hands went up. And put your hands down if you've ever gone back. And it turns out people who do not feel a sense of belonging, they don't go back, they don't cut checks, they don't come back to speak on panels, they're not recommending other students to go there. And in fact, this sort of moves this even further down the road in your question. At the end of these talks, I have alumni come up to me and say, wow, I never thought about it. I always wondered why I don't go back to that campus. I always wonder why I get really irritated when that campus calls me. And you help me really draw a connection between how I think about the campus through this invisible sense of belonging. It is largely invisible. You can't point over there and say, see, that sense of belonging. But it does have behavioral manifestations. I think that alumni who felt a sense of belonging show up to campus for games. They serve on alumni boards. They encourage, they act as ambassadors, telling other students to go there. I think students who feel a sense of belonging in college have bumper stickers on their cars that say, I go to this school. During football games, they draw with paint the symbols of the school or the mascot or whatever on their face. They wear the sweatshirt. They carry the coffee mug because they're so excited about this sense of connectedness. They feel such a part of it that they want things around them to reflect that sense of membership. Well, that trifecta, that is the cognitive dimension that says, I feel like I think I belong here, and it's the idea that I belong. It's the thoughts that people care for me. It is the thoughts that someone's looking out for my success that help me feel the affective. That's the second dimension, affective. I feel like I belong. And as a result of thinking and feeling, I now behave and act like I belong. And I think those come together in really powerful ways that can either enable or inhibit a student from getting good grades, being retained, graduating in a semester, or ultimately earning their degree. Faculty have been really challenging to convince of this. And where I've had the most success is when I hold up the data. When I talk about it and I tell the good, stories, or I see myself trying to draw these linkages through my words, through these three dimensions, the average American's like, okay, that makes sense. But faculty want to see the charts and the numbers, and the book and the journal articles share that information. And I think it helps them realize, if not it's the most important factor, that it is one of a set of critical and factors for success, which moves me to my sort of final segment. That is, now the question is, if you can convince them that it matters, and you can convince them that it's a pretty powerful lever for success, the question is, what do I do about it? And support services, student affairs professionals tend to be there with notes and paper ready to take notes and say, oh my gosh, here's what we can do. We can launch this program and use this experience or work through this club and organization. I think faculty sometimes really honestly struggle to think about, how do I create this sense of belonging in the classroom, especially when some faculty see their job as, and I'm just saying these as examples that I've witnessed, and I talk about in the book, quite frankly. I'm a chemistry professor, and in chemistry, doesn't matter how you feel in the classroom. It matters whether or not you know these formulae and you can remember how to balance an equation, if you can figure out what stoichiometry is, and your math skills really matter a lot. But it actually turns out that belonging even matters in the chemistry classroom. And what I do in the second edition that I did not have for the first edition is, since the book has been out since 2012, so that's about 5 years, I've given hundreds of lectures on belonging at campuses, schools, organizations across the globe. And I've had pen pal relationships with educators who will write me and say, oh my gosh, I heard you talk about belonging. I was convinced it matters. So the very next day I went in the classroom and I did this, and here's what happened. So for instance, one science professor went into her classroom and wrote on the board, "You belong here." And sat down. She had never done this before. Normally the board is filled with equations and whatever the content is for the day. But this particular day, she wrote, "You belong here," sat down and waited for all of her class to arrive. She said that students were nervous. You could sort of see their anxiety as they look at the board, like, "You belong here." Oh my gosh, I don't remember reading that last night in the reading, and looking around like, is this a quiz, a test, is this a joke? And then ultimately the professor gets up and says, we've been in class now, I don't know, 6-7 weeks, I can't remember. And I missed telling you the most important message. The most important message is, you belong here in this classroom. And we're going to get back to the subject matter of the day, but not before I tell you that you have not made a mistake by enrolling in this class. You may not have liked chemistry in high school, but you'll like chemistry this semester. Doesn't matter if you've never been good at chemistry, you've never had chemistry with me, and I've never had it with you, and together we can be successful. And before you know it, she writes about students tearing up, sharing more about, gosh, we've been here for 7 weeks, and I got to tell you, for 7 weeks, I've been battling this idea of what we call imposter syndrome.
Yes.
That I don't have what it takes to be successful here, because we always assume, and I talk about this in the belonging book, part of the belonging, the psychology of belonging is Most people do not start with a sense of belonging. They start with this idea of belonging uncertainty. Most people enter a new setting, new classroom, new job, and wonder, do they belong? They're uncertain about it. But what we actually believe about other people is that all other people feel a sense of belonging. We always believe
we project it on them because they're there before us,
right?
And then it's just us.
We call it pluralistic ignorance in psychology, where we always assume that, you know, we're the only one struggling on the test. We're the only one who missed 3 of the problems on the quiz. Everybody else got a better grade, and it's just not true. So I think this is helpful, you know, really starting to draw these linkages between these bodies of psychology and sociology under this umbrella of sense of belonging for me has been really powerful, because now I know what advice I can offer faculty. For instance, not only might that work, go into the classroom and write on the board, you belong here, and process it with students, but what we've learned is that since we all typically on average, you know, assume that other people are way ahead of us, one thing that faculty and staff can do is help students set realistic goals for themselves and to normalize their beliefs about others. To help students you know, faculty can stand in the front of the room and say, I'm going to go through this example again because lots of students need me to repeat this in order for them to get it. It is very normal for students to read the reading and to have to read it twice because they didn't get it the first time. I remember one time I told my own students, you know, I was writing something and I said, yeah, I had to stop because I was getting writer's block. And they said, you get writer's block? Oh my gosh, you write so much. And I'm like, yeah, and I still get writer's block. But this idea that just because you have written, it must have all flowed perfectly without hiccup. And what we can do is, first of all, help students get rid of that messy thinking by setting the record straight and offering more realistic recall of what happens. The other thing is to, you know, I just did it myself by saying, I told my own students, I encourage faculty when appropriate and when they're ready to be vulnerable in the classroom. You know, students always assume if you're a chemistry professor, you must have gotten straight A's through chemistry. That's not true. Most faculty in their discipline did not ace that subject matter. And it's not about, you know, whining and complaining and saying, no, I'm horrible at math, but I'm a math professor. It's about helping students understand that what Carol Dweck talks about, the difference between this idea of fixed and growth mindset. Yeah. That it's not that I'm perfect at math and that's what makes me a math professor, or that I'm a perfectly you know, skilled and virtuoso at the piano, and that's what makes me a music professor. It's that I work hard to at my craft. I have certainly overcome some setbacks and some struggles. I've learned how to study. I've learned how to seek help. I've become comfortable with failure and learning that failure is part of the hallway to success. I think all of that to me is what faculty and staff, the messages that faculty, staff, and by staff I mean academic advisors, success coaches, people we've been talking about. These are the kinds of messages they can give to students which affect mindset and ultimately make belonging possible in higher education spaces.
Bingo. So there's 2 factors here. The psychology of understanding and bridging the awareness to true understanding for faculty and staff, but then also the implementation of what does that look like when you translate that on a campus. I'm happy to say that a lot of institutions are now, from a geographic level, are combining like student success centers with all of those places in one, like a one-stop shop, which has been exciting to see that they're actually putting money and resources behind moving things around on campus, which is a big investment for that very sense of belonging. Whether they're doing it intentionally, knowing that they're doing it with a belonging context or not, I don't know. But I'm happy with that. Right. And I'm glad that people can find you with maybe consulting for how does that translate that on a campus level, translate that to actionable items with faculty and staff. I want to be respectful of your time. You got time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. Now, with, and by the way, one more thing on that. It sounded almost like when you talked about tangible plans, like that chart and how they speak to students and those tips, and the tough decisions being made of duplication of efforts and having to agree that this department does this or that. It sounds like you're borrowing from elements outside of the domain of like traditional academic domains. That I've seen this a lot in industrial psychology, organizational psychology, and dare I say even business practices. A quick word on like what the business has been a dirty word in higher ed, and being that you're a social entrepreneur in some sense, academic entrepreneur, can you kind of share some of the things that you found in that, as in those identities of like being an academic, a scholar, but also using business practices to help empower, other institutions?
Absolutely. So when I first started, I don't know that I first started using this language. I think people use this language sometimes to describe me early in my career. And as a professor, I was, I like to say I was well trained to be uncomfortable with that kind of language. This idea of an entrepreneur, but a professor. Oh my gosh, that would be horrible, right? Or thinking of higher education as a business. And I was teaching a class one time at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, called Governance and Policy in Higher Education. Part of the class, I would bring senior leaders to the campus. And in fact, the first time I taught this class was in graduate school with my advisor, Don Creamer, at Virginia Tech. And Don and I brought the then president of Virginia Tech, Charles Steger, to class. And President Steger, an academic leader, college president of a large public research university that is at the fore of, scientific innovations, said to our class, Virginia Tech is a Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company. I am the president of a university, but I am also a CEO. And it was the first time I ever saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears an academic leader embrace those two terms, mindsets, and to your point, disciplines, worlds, in a way that was comfortable. And he helped us understand, sure, he understands why we wouldn't, why there's some resistance to adopting that kind of mindset or terminology wholesale, because at the end of the day, we are not about producing only widgets and new ideas and new discoveries and inventions. We are also, and mostly, principally, involved in the business of educating students. But by the same token, he helped us understand, as I'm sort of going off the cuff here, that every day that Virginia Tech was open, was a multi-million-dollar endeavor. Hugely multi-million-dollar endeavor. When you started thinking about the money that was spent for the science labs and the supercomputers and all that kind of thing. So in that case, any one decision that he makes impacts millions and millions of dollars. And I think that higher education has to accept that. It is a unique industry, certainly. It is not like the automotive industry exactly, but it is not unrelated to these industries. And I think even now, as policymakers and politicians are putting more and more pressure on institutions to do more with less, to graduate more students with less resources, students and families are demanding that if they're going to pay these very high tuition rates, that they expect a return on that investment. Those are all business concepts.
Yeah.
And so for me as a scholar, you're exactly right. And I'm so pleased you could detect. I found my training and I found the tools that I need to have that conversation with you and with other audiences, not in higher ed literature. It's in the business teams, and it's in the Harvard Business Review, and it's in on the internet, and special issues that focus on return on investment. And when I start to really expand my working lexicon of business terms and ideas, and I love doing that, and then bring it to higher education, I realize that a lot of what we're talking about in higher education is business related. I mean, I was in New Mexico, gave a keynote on belonging. At the end of it, a gentleman came up to me and said, he asked me, had I ever gone to the Disney customer service training or something?
Yeah, they have big internship programs, and that's a big part of their training yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I said, no, I've never been. He said, oh my gosh, my president sends his top leaders every year. You should go. And I said, why? He said, because they're talking about the same thing you are. I mean, belonging, this idea that we need to step into the shoes of our students, try to experience the campus through their eyes, and then work to remove barriers and declassify privileged language and simplify our processes and make college more hospitable to them is fundamentally customer service. And when I started thinking about belonging, I certainly didn't think about it that way. But to your point, I think those business practices have been really, reading about business practices has been instrumental in shaping my thoughts there. So I encourage my students now, read broadly, not just in education, but certainly in business. All of my graduate students who say they want to be senior leaders, they say, so I'm reading this theory by this person, I'm reading about student development theory, I'm reading about regression and other methods. What else should I read? I'm like, read Time magazine, read some business, social entrepreneur magazine, Google customer service, and then read some online or take some online module so you can really understand these concepts. Because I think higher education, if we're wrapping up soon, we're ending where we began. You began this by asking about higher education being behind. This is another place where I think higher education is behind, and I worry. I actually have
I do too. I seriously
do. A serious, and it grows.
And I'll tell you why. And I think we might have the same reasons why we worry. But go ahead.
I have a concern about higher education that, it's so busy, and it's not every person, but by and large, we're so busy saying we're not business. I don't want to think about business trends and practices. We don't have to compete like the automotive industry for our survival, that we are participating in many ways in our own demise. We will miss out, we'll become old and dilapidated. And I don't really think that, for-profits or MOOCs are our competition. I have an op-ed that I have in my head, I've never written, that the large public research universities like the ones where I've worked will never have to worry about whether or not they're going to exist, at least not in my life. There will always be Virginia Tech. There will always be a University of Virginia. That's my undergraduate alma mater. There will always be a University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and there will always be The Ohio State University. As long as I'm alive, it would take too much to close the doors of those institutions. Some institutions are not privileged in that way, and they had to think about these concerns sooner. But by the same token, there certainly could be, and already is, increased competition amongst these institutions and other providers like for-profits and MOOCs and some of even the consulting agencies that are providing training for job agencies. There's increased competition for the kind of students they're going after. And I think if we could become comfortable thinking about these concepts and how do they really apply in higher education, one that frustrates me all the time is this idea of innovation. Everything in higher education is innovative. If you look up on higheredjobs.com right now, most of the jobs are going to say, especially the executive leader jobs, they're going to say we're looking for an executive leader who's innovative, who's got an entrepreneurial spirit. Well, that's not always true. I mean,
sure you want that?
Yeah. Higher education, it is not. It says that well. It becomes a buzzword, but they don't accommodate true innovators because higher education's entirely too traditional. But I think in order for it to stay on the floor, for it to stay competitive, to go where it needs to go for the future, you actually do need some of these more entrepreneurial, non-traditional, and innovative mindsets present. they don't, not all college presidents have to be from business, but I think that some should. I think some provosts should. I think that some deans should. I think some deans need on their cabinet not just associate deans for research, but maybe even associate deans for innovation and entrepreneurship, which you don't see a lot in higher education. But you certainly see these kinds of positions in business. One that I talk about a lot in business, you hear about chief listening officers. You don't see this at all in higher education. But we need, with the growth of social media and how people get the message out to others, we need someone whose portfolio is to know what is the story that is being propagated and circulated about our institution. And that doesn't happen word of mouth only. It happens on social media, it happens on Snapchat and Instagram and on the web and on the internet. And it certainly does still happen on the streets. And so someone's got to be listening and attentive to those messages so that we'll know how to manage not only
balance those identities,
manage the reputation of the institution, and most importantly, stay responsive to the needs of our learners. So my final example is this. I'm going to say a year ago now, I was at Syracuse University, and I was sitting down with who I'm going to call millennials. Most of them were in that age group. And we were talking about sense of belonging and talking about the work of the institution. At some point, they started to air their frustration with their job. Things like, whenever they have a lot of good ideas, and sometimes they just want to share their ideas with others and have people react just in time to that idea. And they would share stories like if it was the weekend and they had to do work, they would go to a local coffee shop, and they would sit at a large table with virtual strangers with their headphones on. They'd be working. And every now and again, they'd look over at somebody, and if they made eye contact and they had to go to the restroom, they say, "Hey, would you watch my computer while I go to the restroom?" And now they have relationship. And then they come back, and that person would say, "Well, what are you working on?" They say, "Oh, I'm working on this paper," and they throw out the idea, and that person says, "That sounds really interesting. Have you ever thought about this?" And before you know it, that cross-sharing of ideas and challenge, critique, really...
very synergistic, synergy,
And they love this. And they cannot find it in higher education. Well, you find it everywhere in business. In fact, we now live in a day and time where one big business that is booming and growing even larger is this idea of sort of co-working spaces, where I might rent a desk in an office space where there are 10 other entrepreneurs, small teams or individuals. We don't know each other and our work is not related, but we share a space where we work. And in that shared space, community happens and innovation happens. Well, these young new professionals at Syracuse were just frustrated with the fact that they're in offices with closed doors, and they're not expected to, and when they get up from their desks to go for a walk, that's not seen as working. And sometimes standing in the hallway and having conversation and sharing ideas, that's not seen as working. That's seen as goofing off or wasting time. And I remember I tweeted that day because I thought, wow, who in higher education is thinking about re-engineering the workplace for this new millennial professional who doesn't work in places like bygone generations did? Who's thinking about re-engineering the workplace in higher education so that the academic advisors might share an office with multiple workplaces, or there might be a more communal organization to the financial aid office, or however this plays out. And I haven't really seen good models of this. And I worry because most of those new professionals, at the end of it, I at one point in time studied faculty turnover in a project. So I know the questions for measuring turnover. If you can't measure whether or not a person actually leaves a job, the number one predictor of whether or not a person will leave a job is intent to leave that job. So at the end of my conversation, I said, I'm just curious, how many of you intend to leave your job because you're so frustrated with it? Every single hand went up. In fact, of the dozen or so new professionals, I'm talking they were in their first to third year on the job, all of them were presently, at the time I met with them, looking for another job. And most of them were not looking for that next job in higher education. They were looking at places like Amazon and Google and Yahoo and all the places that do it better than higher education. So again, that's my concern. We need these workers. I mean, we're not going to get a whole lot of, older generations are going to approach the age of retirement. We're going to need to be able to captivate the millennials and the newer generation. And so I worry that we're not thinking the way they think in the workplace.
Agreed. And that's a similar extension of my concern is, especially when it comes from, people of color, minorities, low income, no income. Higher ed is sometimes seen as the last stand to really take someone who was young, who didn't have the parents or the social familial background that can help them along through that process. Higher ed is a last stand for those individuals. And if we don't get this right, we're just setting up, we already know what the education gap is. Now we're talking about the career gap, the economic gap of like, all right, when Jose applies for a job versus when Joe applies for a job, we know there's a gap there in hiring practices. We're not setting them up for success after that point. So that's a really big part of my concern. But to your point about the whole business piece, and we can move on just real quick, because I hear some people still. I had a conversation with someone who has a very decorated career in higher ed. He said I was pinpointing some of these things, and he was saying, "Sounds like you're praising business. I don't like that," and it completely shut down the conversation. And it was like jarring for me because I didn't totally see it coming. For people who are still concerned about business, and let me put it to you this way: if you are even from a relationship standpoint, and Terrell, let me know if you co-sign on this. If you had a bad relationship with someone, does that inform all future relationships? It could really scar you. It could really, but you have to. You don't let it rob you from the potential of having a new healthy relationship. Some people have been scarred by a bad experience with marketing or business, and it paints their picture of what business can look like. I would dare say that higher ed has the best opportunity to implement business solutions because business is nothing more than just borrowing from all these other academic domains. You talk about marketing, we're talking about psychology, we're talking about graphic design, we're talking about all these different things. So when it comes to business, I just want everyone to hear me out and hear us out, is that higher ed is positioned the best way possible to implement business solutions because I think we could be better caretakers of how it gets implemented, and I think we gotta let go of this gut reaction, this stereotyping of the process of what it looks like with Enron or with these money-hungry, greed CEOs who are taking billions of salaries and all these things. We gotta cut that mental framework and say, hey, we don't want to associate that with that completely. So I'll just leave that there.
I think that what you just said, and I hope not only that folks who are listening live, but folks who listen to the podcast later will, replay this. I hope they'll listen to all of it and share it and tweet it and find it useful in their domain of work. But this last piece is so important because I think that, I'm of the mindset that anything that will help me do what I'm trying to do better,
bingo,
is
on the table.
My consideration. It's worth my study. And certainly, I'm a musician, so I've learned some techniques from jazz musicians. I've learned some techniques from folks who, I don't play the guitar, I play the piano, but I've learned some techniques from guitarists who have really helped me think about how to break down jazz chords and how to move through sort of syncopated beats and so forth in ways that I hadn't even imagined. And someone would have said, well, you're a piano player. Why are you listening to a guitar player? Why are you hanging out with the guitarist? Because ultimately my goal is to be skilled when I play. And if I can learn something from the guitarist or learn something from the percussionist, I think it's worth my consideration. I think the same is true in higher education. I'm not, hook, line, and sinker about the adoption of a business mindset in higher education. I think it is, wild and short-minded and short-sighted for us to say that we're not a business because we do engage in business practices in exchange for tuition dollars. Generally speaking, we make a number of promises to students
Right.
about the skills and the experiences they can have. I think that if we could think more deeply about that business transaction in ways that push us to be more efficient, to be more consumer or customer focused. You know, I call it out all the time in public talks. I've been to hundreds of campuses, Joed, who say they're student centered, right? Got it in their mission statement, have it on the website, and then you go to the campus, and you know, these are the kind of examples that I see. Some are a bit superficial but real, and some are more substantive. You know, on the student-centered campus, you're walking, and all of the reserved parking is not for students; it's for faculty and staff. You on the student-centered campus, you have really wonderful furniture in the conference room for the president and for the provost, and that's absolutely appropriate. But you have really unattractive and old, maybe even surplus furniture in the student lounge and in the student conference room. You have state-of-the-art technology in the classrooms that the faculty member uses, and in the spaces where department meetings happen. But in the student lounge, you have a restricted number of just okay kind of computers and printing for cost. And you know, the tagline for the campus is not only is it student centered, but it's also committed to open access and underrepresented students. Well, underrepresented students, especially low income and no income, one, can't pay for printing all the time, especially not the kind of printing that most faculty want them to do. And then two, they certainly can't pay for parking. So I've always thought about these blatant contradictions between our espoused values as a institution, as an industry, and then what they look like in practice. And it's been this sort of thinking through these business lenses. What does customer service really look like? What does it mean to really focus on a bottom line? What would be our bottom line if we had one in higher education? And how do we stay true to that in ways that really open my eyes to, wow, maybe we should be thinking about controlling costs of student parking for certain groups. Maybe we should be thinking about discounting, subsidizing parking for, so as part of our access mission, we think about discounting tuition, but what about the hidden costs of attending college? And it's, for me, it's been those business mindsets that really got me there. And then finally, it takes us back to what we were talking about. Belonging matters. It matters not just in education, it matters in industry. I've been really excited about, I've had some, not enough or not a lot, but opportunities to go into companies to talk about belonging, because it turns out if you want committed employees, if you want people to stay around for the long haul, if you want employees who will see you through a merger or a downsizing, it's those employees that feel that sense of belonging. So community matters, even in the workplace, even in the corporation, from the moment the person joins the team until the time they are promoted to mid-level or senior management. Now let's get together and think about what are the strategies for making sure that not only think about the customer and their bottom line, but the staff member or the employee in corporations and in businesses, same way we think about in education. And I think you're right on that this intersection between education and business is only going to be more important in years to come.
Yeah, and then the stewards, we have to be a good steward of that integration. And I can see the first wave didn't work out. The for-profit schools are hurting now more than ever. The federal government is holding them more and more accountable, and it's getting harder and harder for them to recruit. They're still doing okay, but the first wave didn't work out. I'm worried about that second wave where they kind of get their ducks in a row and they try to take more. So I think we're the best positioned to be good stewards of that integration. I'm glad we're on the same page with that. I would love to continue this discussion. I mean, I could go on longer, and we can break it up in 2 episodes if you want, or we can save the other context of looking forward about how this translates to career readiness, which is super important for people of color, as we know, hiring practices being what it is, when you have a different last name, so to speak, and talking
or a
about
different
this
first name.
yeah. I mean, when people say my name is Joed, they always think it's a typo. Like, man, this guy can't even spell his first name right. No, it's spelled correctly.
People see my name. I was told in once. I mean, I never really thought about it, to be quite honest. But education taught me that education and educators taught me that my name is an identity marker. I had an educator who told me in no uncertain terms, straight to my face, that I had the blackest name on earth. And I thought,
oh my goodness.
And I never thought that of Terrell really as a black name, although pretty much every Terrell that I know is an African American male. But I guess it's the combination of Terrell and Lamont. I always thought Strayhorn could be misread as Native American, and it does have certain, it has clear Native American roots, but it's the first two names that really mark me. And to your point, I think that students who go into the workplace with not just name markers, but all sorts of characteristics that reflect aspects of their true or perceived self have a unique experience, have unique barriers to success in their career. I think we can say a couple things, and then if you don't mind, we can save it for another episode.
I can go. I mean, I could do this all day. I could do this all day.
Yeah, I would love to come back and carry on about that topic. But here's what I'd say about career readiness, especially for
because Tora, I can split this if you want. We can keep on going. I can split this easily if you want. If you're in the flow of it, we can do that too.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, good. All right, great. So career readiness, how are you thinking about that right now?
Yeah. So the way I think, when I first started my my public talks, especially those that really started to reach not just through the research, but beyond the research, like what are the broader impacts and implications of this work, I would start my keynotes with an opening slide that really talked about, who are students. Here's the number of students we have. Here's what we know about their ethnic and gender diversity. But nowadays, I mean, it's a new year, so I don't know exactly. My first talk of 2018 is tomorrow at SUNY Broome. And so I will have a different sort of approach to that one. But in all of 2017 and maybe even 2016, I started these talks with a slide that I developed that shows the skills that employers say they want college graduates to have. If you look at Money Magazine, the labor employment website
about it too.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you look at any Time magazine, look at anything, Google what employers want in college.
Yeah, they spelled it out for us for many years already.
Yeah, we get these long lists. And so what I did was I put a couple of those together and started finding linkages amongst them. And you learn that there are sort of 7 to 9 things that employers want. Some of the ones I remember is, of course, employers still want college graduates who can communicate effectively in written and in oral form. They want college graduates who can use technology proficiently. They want and still need college graduates who can work well on diverse teams. But interestingly enough, I've seen probably in the past 2 years, many more references to the need for college graduates who are creative, who can imagine, who can solve problems. And the one I love talking about is who are good storytellers. And so I was keynoting a meeting that brought together a lot of business heads, and there were a lot of people who worked in like talent development and HR there. And so I had that on the screen. I said, look, I give this talk all the time, or I talk about this all the time. I have a question. Are you really looking for people who are creative and imaginative and know how to tell good stories? I put it on the slide and I saw it in the magazine. I saw it on these websites, but I don't know. And before I could even finish, these folks are just, throwing their hands up like popcorn, like absolutely. Why? Because what
ROI.
we know is that the problems that they are trying to address are not discipline bound.
Mm.
You know, it's not the mathematician who's going to be able to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. It's not the economist or the historian or the social worker or the engineer. It is actually the person. It's all of those people coming together and bringing their expertise to the table in ways that says, hey, here's what I know and what I see through the training I have, but they are flexible enough to work on a diverse team and hear from an economist things that they had not even imagined or been able to see. And to have all of that problematized by an ethicist who says, yeah, but there's an ethical dimension to this we got to think about as well. And when you get that kind of diverse team together, all college educated folks, thinking about the same problem, now you have, I think, the conditions for true solution of our problems, maybe even transformation of society. And that's what employers say they want from us. So I think when we think about career readiness, I always say to audiences, what students need is an educational experience. And we're going to talk about college, right? So whether it's 2-year or 4-year, I say what students need, back to the word you introduced to us earlier, curriculum broadly conceived. They need a curriculum broadly conceived. By that I mean in the classroom and outside the classroom, with faculty and even through clubs, organizations, internships, co-ops, study abroad, whatever it might be. They need a curriculum that gives them, equips them with those skills.
Bingo.
That they can then take into the workplace and use to solve the problem of that employer. Because we live in this kind of, you know, knowledge-based society where you make money because you can either fix people or fix things, and you can use your skills in service to those goals. The other thing we need to appreciate is, you know, my grandmother, who I love talking about, who's deceased now. She's been deceased for 4 years. My grandmother was a public school teacher for 50 years before she retired. In the 50 years, she only taught in 2 different districts, and she spent most of her time, over 40 years, in one district, one school, one classroom. Those days are pretty much over. That is not to average worker. As we in higher education, the educators, the academic deans, the provosts, the presidents, as we think about the fact that we're educating the worker of tomorrow, we have to also appreciate that work has changed. How people do it has changed. You know, your opening question is a marvelous one, and that is, how do people start? How do I think about juggling multiple gigs and having different hustles that ultimately become a life's purpose? Well, nowadays, almost everybody has you know, a side hustle or a second job or a third job. Most labor and labor economics specialists or scholars will tell you that 30 years ago, they talked a lot about people being bivocational. That was a term that they used. You could go to their conferences, they used it. You could look in their journals, they used it. Nowadays, they don't use that term because the average American is bivocational. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. Driving down my street and around the city, I see tons of cars that have Lyft or Uber in the window. You know, a public school teacher who's a teacher by day and a Lyft driver by night. I had a dentist who was a dentist by day, and he drove for Uber at night because his daughter was in college. I have no idea why a dentist needs to drive for Uber. It's not my business, but this is the kind of world we live in. So for me, I think the implications for higher education is, how do we train students to be an engineer, a social worker, a historian, an archivist, a music teacher, whatever. Even,
oh my goodness, an artist even.
An artist, you know, and it's not just those industries. I mean, 2-year institutions play critical roles in preparing electricians and those who will go on to work in the automotive industry. And nowadays, with the whole pesticide and bed bug movement, we need people who mix those chemicals together and become the folks who terminate the infestations. Well, if that's going to happen, institutions have to understand that almost all the people I just named might also be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, or they might convert their living room into a daycare. Or, and this is also interesting, we've learned, they might be a public school teacher or an artist for the first 7 years out of college, and then grow interested in something else.
Yes.
And not just become a senior artist, they might change industries altogether.
Yep.
We have 40 million Americans right now working in jobs that did not exist in this country 4 or 5 years ago. That is, we didn't even know that you could be a search engine optimization specialist 5 years ago. Yep. Now people have that title everywhere. We didn't know that we would have drone pilots 5 years ago. Now we have them in larger numbers. So I think work has changed, work positions has changed, the labor market has changed, and then the patterns that people follow in pursuit of their why, their ultimate job, has also changed. So then, final implication, what is it? Our job in higher education is, especially for those who work in career services, for those who are those faculty advisors and academic advisors, we have to be sure that we understand this so that we're not preparing students as if they're going to have one job.
There you go.
Their entire life. But we need to make sure that the average college graduate today coming out certainly knows how to negotiate, because they're going to negotiate job offers and salary for multiple jobs. Let me see, the average American has between 12 and 14 different jobs by the time they turn 40. So then how do you do that? And they have usually between 2 or 3 different industry changes before retirement. That is, I was a teacher, and then I became convinced that I could make a greater impact as a social worker. So after finishing my master's in social work, I became a social worker until I became frustrated with the system. And then all of a sudden I realized that really nonprofits is where it's at. So I launched my own nonprofit until I got really burnt out with my own business. And I decided I was going to end up just working with children through my daycare that I run in my home while I drive for Lyft. Well, what college or university trained that individual?
You just described almost to a T a conversation I had with a student.
Really?
That very conversation of social work first and launch a nonprofit and work with children, like entertaining that concept and that trajectory, and what does the timeline look like? Do you start small now and have those things going at the same time? Do you just master one and then make the shift later when you're financially secure? You just nailed it. Exactly.
You just mapped out other pieces for higher education. Think about, like, so we should be having conversation. Again, I don't think it's just career services. I think that the curriculum, broadly conceived, needs to be
embedded in that. Yes,
that it's teaching students raw skills at decision making, thinking through timing,
yes,
of decision making, planning, saving, networking. Because how will the teacher become the social worker, and the social worker become successful at launching the nonprofits? It's only through having really solid communication skills and networking skills, delegation skills, and maybe even some technology skills. Because, you know, right now I run my own consulting company. I have a guy on my team who takes care of a lot of the communications and the social media. But if he was on this call with us right now, he would tell you every now and again, Strayhorn himself comes up with a cool flyer or comes up with a cool concept that I don't have the time to put on paper. But I'm able to see
it's on the radar.
It's on the radar. I see the message. I see how it delivers the message to a certain group. And I think those are those more fundamental skills that higher education has to be concerned about and be teaching, you know, old time language across the curriculum.
Yeah.
The engineer needs this just as much as the artist.
Yeah. So, and the question is, we didn't notice that Dr. Terrell and I didn't say whether or not we liked this new gig-based economy. We didn't
Right.
say that we have to like it. And
Right.
higher ed leaders, you don't have to like it. The thing that you have to do is acknowledge it's not just around the corner; it's already here,
Right.
and it's our responsibility to adapt and empower our students for this quote-unquote new economy. The amazing stat of the biggest hotel chain doesn't own a hotel building. It's Airbnb. The biggest taxi service doesn't own a car. It's Uber. And all these different, like, what the biggest, and then with Amazon buying Whole Foods. I mean,
Right.
the biggest just grocery market chain, you know, for the longest time didn't own a store until just recently they bought them out because they had the cash to do that. So we're just saying, besides the ethics and how we feel about that, let's put that aside. This is the reality, and it's our responsibility to embed that.
And our responsibility, I think, is right where you left it, even deeper, and that is we have a responsibility to our students, because most of our mission statements and all of our guides imply that a student will be, I mean, it takes us right back to the question that you asked here, that they will be career ready.
Yep.
Ready for, I was working with the campus one time, consulting with the campus, and I was really impressed with their ambition. They had an initiative that they had launched called Ready for the World. All of their graduates would be ready for the world. And my support of that ambition was authentic. But as I left that project and thought about it, I thought, gosh, there's a serious critique of higher education, because I don't think most college students in this country are ready for their city or ready for their local community, let alone ready for the world. I mean, we have, look at the headlines. You have interracial conflict on the same campus. You have cultural clashes happening within a major department. You have, sit-ins and protests and hunger marches happening at colleges and universities, not because of what's happening in another world. Sometimes it's what's happening on their own campus or in their local vicinity. I think because we tell students, hey, come here, study with us, earn our degree, and you will be career ready. We have a responsibility. That's the word you introduced in the conversation, and it's so perfect. We have a responsibility then to make sure that our curriculum, broadly conceived, prepares them for that career, that world, not the world old, but this new world. And that really requires, sharpening of our curriculum and sharpening of our instruction and renovation of our courses. I see all the time on that list of things that employers want. One of the things they want is employers say they want college graduates who can, and this one's hard, who can listen and reserve judgment. Or last year, at the end of the year, when I was giving public talks, I used as an example, this is what employers say they want. Educated folks who can listen and reserve judgment, and we need it. Why do we know we need it? Look at the presidential debates. I mean, there's two educated folks who cannot pause to listen to each other and reserve judgment. They're so busy jumping and talking over each other and arguing, fighting. That's not just the presidential debates. In fact, critique of my own instruction up until that point was, in my classes, I use debate a lot as an instructional strategy. I wanted students to pick a side and argue it. But what I've started to do more is not push them to pick a side yet. Have them consider both mindsets. What if you were in support of this policy or this decision? Now switch hats if you're going to be against it, so you can anticipate what those thoughts might be of those on the opposing team. Democracy, the ability to create democracy and live in it, comes out of that kind of training, one that teaches you to be understanding and empathetic to those who are different from yourselves. And I think that not only for democracy, it also makes you a very good professional or employee in the workplace. You can work on diverse teams when you can listen to people whose opinions are different. They see the world different. You might even find value in their difference rather than just reject it. Higher education's a pretty long way off from that.
I agree. I think there's a huge opportunity lost in that circle. And just to kind of make it meta, I mean, the top, those 7 to 9 things that employers want, almost all of them find its home in belonging. And which I'm reading a great book that people might find interesting. It's called The Speed of Trust. Which, when you talk about belonging, you're really talking about the seed of belonging is essentially trust. Right. But it's a great book. And whether it's employment, a lot of that centers around belonging, working in teams. You got to be able to do that. And when I'm telling students, when it comes to curriculum, because I was fortunate, and we're talking about multiple gigs. I have Penn Visio. I have clients with denominations and higher ed associations. We're helping with tech and all those things. I also do some public speaking here and there. I have the podcast. And then also I work part-time with a community college, helping them launch and spearhead a career boot camp or a career development program. So all these little hats I'm wearing, talk about this new economy, I'm living and breathing it, and when one of the things I do with the students is part of the networking is the research gathering, because the world that we live in, I mean, the career services, not to pick on them, but I've had a conversation with the director of career services once after a speaking engagement where he said, well, it's not our fault they don't come in. They're in the faculty classrooms. It's their responsibility to kind of like bring them over to our offices because we can't force students to come in. And it was so just the mindset was so antiquated. And I'm trying to look for the word. It's divorced from the mission of going to students where they are with this stuff, that students don't even know what to ask sometimes. So this networking is a great opportunity to be research undercover. There's some students who not even, they want to be engineers. They don't know one engineer in their family or friends. Well, if you want to be an engineer, you better start interviewing and networking with engineers to see what their road was like. Because we are stereotyping the career journey just like we're stereotyping students. And they are graduating in several $1,000s in debt, not ready for this quote-unquote real world as a result. So there's one last point about this too. We talk about democracy and the presidential debates on those things. We are a type of democracy that's a republic. And what's so interesting about that, and I think you appreciate this, is that a republic is different in a democracy, in that a democracy, the majority rules, and the other side has to shut up, and that's it. A republic is a representative. So even if it's a minority, you have rights and a platform to voice something, regardless of whether you're in a minority or not. And in higher ed, it's a beautiful place to be a platform to voice that and to learn from one another. And the reason why I get fired up for this is because we are sending our students who are people of color into thousands of dollars of debt, telling them that if you get a degree, you'll get a job. Right. And that's not the case anymore. Yep. And I'd rather, while I wait for political reform to make things right, I want our students, especially those who are people of color, to get their money game right, and they can be their own transformation. They can fund their own transformation in their local communities, and they can't do that if they're not getting hired, especially at top wages. So that's why there's a racial, economic, social dimension to career readiness as it relates to people of color, low income, no income students. I get super fired up, and I'm so glad that you're finding that belonging even attaches to that career. Yeah,
I mean, there are so many things that you just said that deserve accent, and if we were on Twitter, it would be a retweet, and that is, I say a lot that you nailed it. In higher education, we always spend a lot of time, and as scholars, we are guilty of writing about the fact that students don't seek help. Male students don't know how to seek help. Men of color don't seek help. And in fact, you could read the research and look at what happens in practice and start to conclude that they don't want to ask for help. And you'd be incorrect if you concluded that, because everybody who needs help and knows that they need help, even if they don't have the wherewithal to ask for it or know where to turn for it, desires it, would appreciate it if it came.
Yes.
So, higher education's organized, it's privileged, it is set up as a culture where, with our short-sightedness, we get them to the door, we say, welcome to our campus, see you in 4 years, when we shake your hand. I mean, this is literally the script that some presidents and provosts use. And we used to think that this was great, get them at the front and say, see you in 4 years when you walk across that stage and receive your degree. But if that is truly where we leave them, we won't see them in 4 to 5 years to receive that degree. And then it's up to them to figure out, as you said, what are my questions? Is that a legitimate question? Who do I ask this question to? Do they even provide support or help in this area? And what I think we need to do in our efforts to be more student-centered, more success-centered, is to make sure that we are organized as an institution, as a industry, to give help.
Yes.
We anticipate students' needs. That, we are proactive and maybe even intrusive in
Yes,
advising,
sir. Yes, sir.
and in providing support. That we have enough information now. This is why the whole big data
Mm.
me in higher education is exciting. It's not just exciting because it's big data and it makes it sound sexy, and it's large data sets that can be used to run really sophisticated statistical models, but that we can use this information based on large numbers of past students to come up with some degree of certainty about the likelihood that today's student might face the same challenge. And if we can use these kinds of models, predictive models, in an ethical, culturally appropriate way that's not tracking students and it's not casting students into boxes, but allows us to say it may be the case that a student would struggle in this next class because of their pattern of achievement to this point, and that they can't be successful in this next class, this next level of math, science, English, music, art, history, physical education without additional supports. And now we use the information to create a more tailor-made experience for the student that provides for them the supplemental instruction, the out-of-class success coaches or peer tutors that they need in order to be successful. That, to me, is the winning combination. And it's not the student has to come to us and, as a student once said to me, and out themselves as as in need, out themselves as
one of those students,
out themselves as not getting it. They can preserve their integrity as a learner, and we can use, sometimes they do have to raise their hand and say I need help, but that we have enough wherewithal and knowledge now to start to anticipate their successes, their barriers and their struggles before the problem is so great that they can't recover from it.
Can I throw a phrase by you?
Yeah.
I think you might. We need to move from curriculum-based models to maybe curation-based models. I just find, because curation implies vetting, and in this new economy, in this new job market, information is no longer power. And I want to repeat that because we throw that around a lot, especially if you're an academic advisor and you just happen to wear the hat of career advisor, because we know that happens. They're going to step into an opportunity-based counseling office before they step into the career-based office, because they know that you get them. So let's put that in context. But information is not power. Vetting is power. If you don't know what to Google, the terms you have to even to Google, you're not going to get the information you need to get to. So we got to design it in such a way where it's curation based as opposed to curriculum based. We check off the boxes, and the students seem a little more in the driver's seat, so to speak. And that's what I love about this. My take on career development with Essex County College was because not only do we score off the charts with student satisfaction, we actually empower the department to create new opportunities. Because when we talk to a business, we talk to an organization that does incubators for businesses, and we had some business students who they knew business, and that's all the buzzword they knew, and they have no idea where to take that. That could be finance, that could be marketing, that could be all kinds of things. They didn't know where to take it to. I just made a connection, and we went to the incubator, and the senior vice president was happy to host us, give us a tour, and hold a Q&A. And boom, a lot of students found that more empowering than me to kind of just tell them off the top of my head, this is what I think about this career. Listen, those who are listening, who are in a position, I am going to say this with some level of certainty, that there's a good chance you don't know the career field and how it's evolved, and you might have been out of touch for many years, and it's really important that you position yourself as this is my opinion, get second recommendations and confirm it within yourself, because like you said, Dr. Terrell, there's jobs and markets that are bubbling up that we can't even fathom, that are even in a creation right now. So we have to speak with humbleness when we talk about career advice and pointing students in a certain direction.
our conversation is evolving so organically in a way that is really awesome. You know, your mention of search engine, well, your mention of not even, you know, sometimes people not even knowing the terms to use to search for something on Google, created an avalanche of thoughts in my head that I'd like to sort of
Sure.
a little bit here, as it relates to student success. So the first is, back to what we were talking about earlier in this episode and the previous, when I started thinking about higher education and business and innovation and bottom line and efficiency and customer service, and what is it that industry or businesses want from higher education, and I came with those 7 or 9 traits that I talk about in my public lectures. I also started thinking about jobs of the future. So behind that slide is usually a list of like the top 10 cool jobs in the country. And usually on that list, search engine optimization specialist is one of them. And a lot of audiences in higher education, they're like, oh, isn't that like a computer science major? And I'm like, no. So I had to do research on search engine optimization. And cool, when I started my company, I worked with a company to develop some materials for the business website and other kinds of things. And when I met with this team, there was a member of the senior leadership team who was all about new contracts and acquisition. That was getting my business. There were 1 or 2 graphic and web designers there, but there were 2 search engine optimization specialists at the table. And in conversations with them and through my research, this is what I learned. Most search engine optimization specialists don't have degrees in computer science. Some of them do, not all of them. Most search engine optimization specialists have training degrees in more what I'm going to call human-based fields like psychology and sociology, because the job of the search engine optimization specialist is exactly what you just said, and that is to think like we think. You know, my best example in public talks, or one of my examples in public talks, is when you go outside, not you, but anyone goes outside and, you know, has an unfortunate experience, that is their neighbor's dog breaks loose, comes in their yard and bites them on the leg. Most people don't run in their house, jump on their computer and type in personal injury attorney. What they type in is things like dog bite, ouch, sue. You know, and it's the search engine optimization specialist who's done all the thinking and the research and the processing and the tagging and in consultation with the designers, that when we hit enter, Google gives us personal injury attorneys in our area that we might work with to raise this case with our neighbor for their dog biting us. And your mention of that in this podcast made me think about 2 things. One, I'll come back to later, this concept that I sort of fell into and I write about in the 2nd edition of the Belonging book, about an academic spotter. But now I'm curious, like, who's the search engine optimization specialist of higher education? What positions, advisors, deans, provosts, faculty, those who work in admissions and enrollment services, whose job is it, and who has the skills that we need to think like the students think, to help us figure out what are the questions that might be on their mind, what are they likely to, how are they going to ask the question so that we can anticipate it and already prepare the answer for it? When are they likely to raise this question, and where? And how might the question be different based on your major, minor, where you live on campus, your year, your race, your sexual orientation? And if we can do this, that is, collect all of this information or start to ask these questions, I think we can do some things that I've seen in practice, and that is start to, much like we said in the last episode, build and connect and integrate support services so that students don't have to run all over campus, lose time and energy in pursuit of their degree, trying to figure out where the heck do I find a financial aid advisor? Where the heck do I, lay my hands on someone who can help me, who can counsel me through these changes I'm experiencing in myself personally, while I am balancing the academic demands that I have in the classroom. So many students I've interviewed over the years talk about it's not just what happens in the classroom. Some of the stuff is what's happening within me. I'm learning things about myself and I'm rejecting old messages that I picked up from my parents or my pastor, and I'm arriving at, you know, new places cognitively.
Yes.
I need someone who can help me understand that I'm not a bad person because I don't believe what my grandma taught me anymore. Or I'm not a bad person because I don't find it comfortable to sit at home with cousins who are not who are comfortable in their racism or comfortable in their sexism, and I can't operate that way anymore. You know, who's going to help students become comfortable with this more enlightened place that they might reach, and we hope that they will reach through higher education. Well, this search engine optimization idea has potential, that we would ask the question. So at Cornell University, I know they have a website called Ask Ezra, named after the institution's namesake, Ezra Cornell. If you go to Ask Ezra, you can Google it. It's a site where you can type in things like, where do I get my student ID? Where do I get my parking pass? How do I handle a parking ticket? Where do I find tutoring? What happens if I miss an exam? And you get answers from that one site, you know? And some, over the years, they've built this site and populated volunteer writers, I understand, at Cornell, populate the most frequently asked questions that students have. I know at Oregon, they're doing something similar, and they're trying to expand it so it's not just the questions that are on students' mind, because new faculty have questions when they arrive too.
Wow.
And they're trying to start to populate their site with the questions that faculty might have. Again, I think we start thinking about search engine optimization broadly conceived. What are the questions? What are the answers? How might we build sites? Or this could be a brochure, it could be a directory, it could be a lot of things. Newsletter that starts to provide those answers to students in ways, students, faculty, and staff in ways that enable their success. I'll stop because I want to go to the academic advisor or academic spotter thing a little bit later, maybe.
Yeah, no, and again, that's a trend. Now, here's the thing, because when we're building new systems for those solutions, a lot of the times the complaint is, well, if we're going to meet students in terms of career readiness, well, the career landscape changes a lot. So it's really unfair for the institution to bear that burden, and also, let's be real, bear the financial costs to that burden. I interviewed a president who made that point, and it's a valid point, because it does cost to adapt to the world of work, especially if it's changing faster than ever. Right. My point is this: being great is hard. Being good at something is hard, and that's like saying, hey, we can't keep up with the trend, so we're going to slow down or we're not going to do it. You're already just ordering up your own tombstone. And let's be honest, a lot of the small liberal arts universities have closed down already. They've already felt the purge of a lot of the students transferring for not being able to do basic things to accommodate students. When it comes to advisors who can't keep up with this thing, what can they do? Well, we went through a lot of scenarios there, but in the meantime, we're already seeing higher ed model successful things that seem to be working. I wouldn't even have asked I didn't know about Ask Ezra, and you're sharing it here, and I'm a techie person who follows these trends, and I'm still, you never know where you're going to get this stuff. Right. So it's super powerful. But go ahead.
I was fascinated by that. I mean,
admissions?
One, I think, when I heard about it, and then as I started going to other campuses, I would share these examples. That's the other cool thing about being a professor and researcher who is, I know personally, I am, I like to say unapologetically committed to public engagement. I think that there are faculty members. I have good friends who are faculty members who do research and writing. They put it in a journal, and as long as it gets in the journal, they are fine. If it gets picked up by someone in their lifetime, then great. If it does not, they will continue to move forward the boundaries of knowledge in their discipline or field. For myself, I can certainly engage in that intellectual activity and have. I mean, I certainly have written things that I don't think anyone's probably ever read. But I'm far more energized and passionate about the work that I know says something that I can then participate in getting it in the hands of people who need to hear it. And they may not need to hear it the way that it shows up in the journal article. There most audiences that I'm trying to work with and trying to increase their capacity would not need to read the journal article. What they need is for me to translate that research and theory into practical terms. Give me 5 things I can try and do, so that I can, you know, be a better teacher, be a better principal, be a better professor, professional, or, like I said, be a better student. And in my work in that space, I've seen lots of different good models and good examples and things that work. And being one who moves and speaks across different campuses, about 3 or 4 years ago, I just saw this illustration in my head of a bee who picks up something and takes it to another plant or a flower and cross-pollinates.
Yes.
And I started thinking about how I'm that bee sometimes, and many of us are, who get to help cross-pollinate good ideas. That, you know, if this is one way of doing it, the Ask Ezra website, maybe there are ways of doing it at other campuses, a 2-year school or 4-year school or even a high school. It doesn't have to be Ask Ezra. It doesn't have to be Ask Anyone. It's just creating websites or newsletters or guides, or investing in the creation of a position of a person who becomes that go-to person for those who need assistance and help. And to me, I think that kind of work is not only really meaningful, but I've seen it actually produce results. I've seen where, you know, if you watch it over time, students start saying, just like, you know, nowadays, everybody Googles everything, you know? And I've met students who say, you have a question? Oh, before you go to your academic advisor, before you go to your faculty member, go to Ask Ezra. Before you do, hey, look up your phone, go to this site, start there, and then use that as the roadmap to where you go next. And I may as well go there because now it's like right up against it. You know, these kind of epiphanies and ideas, and really they're metaphors that I think we can apply in practice that really open up ideas. So at one of my big birthdays that I had a couple of years ago, I remember everybody who was turning that age was starting to work out in the gym, and I thought, well, I'm a fun-sized guy. By that I mean I'm like 5'6". I'm like 130 pounds on my best day, and so I'm not the world's largest man physically, and so I would, you know, it would take some time for me to realize, like, why would I go to the gym? I'm not trying to be muscular beyond what I am right now. You know, I usually eat 1 or 2 meals a day. Most of my friends who work out eat many more times than that. But anyway, following the trend, and you shouldn't do this, but I did, I decided I'm going to get a gym membership. And I'm going to go into the gym, and I'm going to work out. I go to the gym, and it's not until I get in the gym that I realized I have no idea what workout means. You know, I've never been in the gym before. I mean, it's like PE in high school, but the gym is not that. So what I do is like what most people do when they're in unfamiliar territory. You look around and you start picking up lessons from those around you. So I watch people run on the treadmill. To me, they just were standing on this machine running. So I decided I'm going to do that for a while. No technique, no form, just doing it, right? And while I'm, you know, running on the treadmill, I'm still looking around. I'm watching people lift little hand weights. I said, oh, I'm going to do that in a little bit. And then I'm watching people do squats. I'm going to do that in a while. So before you know it, I've exhausted myself copying a whole bunch of other people who I don't know what their goals are. I don't know if they're weightlifters or if they are, you know, I know nothing about them. And so I go back to the gym the second day. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do the same routine. And this night I'm in there running on the treadmill, and I watch a man lift weights with like a dumbbell, like on the bench. And I watched him for a long time. And I started taking note of, I'm a pretty observant, you know, person. So I watched, he had the bar, he had maybe 2 or 3 weights on each end of the bar. He squatted before he got under the bar. And I remember this, the whole routine. And I say the next day, I'm going to come and I'm going to lift weights. But I noticed this guy has gloves on. So I go to Dick's Sporting Goods that night, and I remember this guy's name is Christian. I said, Christian, I need weightlifting gloves. And my shoes were red, so I wanted red gloves. So I got gloves. Go to the gym the next night. I'm going to lift weights, Joanne. I go in there. I do exactly what I saw that other guy do. I put 2 or 3 weights on the end of the bar. I squat. I get under the bar, and I start to lift. Only problem is I cannot get that bar up at all. I mean, it takes quite some time for me to do it. Well, long story short, pulling on everything that is within me, and probably even without me, my goodness, my gods, my grandmother's spirit, everybody, I finally get this bar lifted. Now, someone else watching this probably would say, why don't you reduce the weights? Because I don't know anything about reducing weights. Only thing I know is I'm mimicking and watching someone else, do exactly what they did. Well, I got the bar up eventually, and then I realized it's way heavier than I ever imagined. And now I've got to somehow use what little bit of strength I have left to get it down. Well, it wasn't going well, and I probably would not have been able to attend this podcast if it had gone the way it was supposed to go. But fortunately for me, just as disaster was lurking, and I mean seconds away from happening, this gentleman shows up out of nowhere, grabs the bar, takes it off of me, reduces the weights, helps me get the feeling back in my arm, and then says, now try lifting. And I start lifting, and he watches me. He counts. He tells me to put it down, take a break. At some point, I'm like, are you like a weightlifter? He said, no. So what are you doing? He said, I'm spotting you. I said, spotting me? What does a spotter do? He said, a spotter observes. He's here. He's present.
There you go.
Spotter encourages you, cheerily. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. Come on, just one more in this rep, and then you get to rest. It reminds you of where you are in your pathway to your goal. You're on the second of 4 reps. You're on 5 of 10. They encourage you. As long as you're doing well, their job is to cheer you on and motivate you and let you see the path and the course even when you can't see it. Now, the moment you have difficulty or struggles, they are also very attentive and observant to you and your experience, and they make sure you don't take on too much weight, and that when you have done so, they're there to relieve you of that burden, to catch it and relieve that stress or burden before there's problems or danger. Well, all I remember doing is I heard him explain it to me, and I was like, stop. Pull out my cell phone, and I started writing down everything he said to me, because to me, that has direct practical application to higher education.
Yeah.
And I was the keynote speaker for the NACADA conference in 2014, and that's where the first sort of epiphany I had about this. And I said to the audience, as I say now on the podcast, who are the academic spotters for students in higher education? Those, they could be peers, they could be faculty, they could be staff members, they could be family members who are engaged by the institution, whose job it is to celebrate, encourage, motivate them to keep going, don't give up, help them keep their eye on where they are in their process, keep their eye on the goal, to know you only got 2 more courses in this sequence left before you're done with that unit, and you completed all
almost there.
Requirements. Who also monitors how much weight they're taking on, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. Who can tell them, you know what, I wouldn't run for president of this clever organization in the same semester that I'm going to also try to rush a fraternity or sorority and take chemistry and math. Who are these folks, and how can we maximize this idea, this concept, that in a way that really streamlines student success and helps us really be more student focused, so that, much like, the other cool thing about it is, back to our point earlier, I didn't ask this guy for help. He saw me in need and rushed to my rescue. That's the help giving, help seeking versus help giving, the curriculum versus curation dichotomy we talked about earlier. So if we could create, I don't know if that's the next title, but create academic spotters in college, whose job it is to anticipate, when is this person going to need help, and to rush in before they even ask for it, when they might not even realize I didn't realize. Well, toward the end, I did realize that if no one helped me, I'd be dead. But for a long time, for a while there, I thought I just got to get my arm right, and if I could just, if I could push from my legs, not my chest. But I was fighting a losing battle, and so many times I have met students who are fighting losing battles. Taking organic chemistry and calculus 2 and psychology 101, and we know that you don't do that. In fact, at my former institution, last little illustration here, I was on a team that was responsible for the integration of predictive data in analytics around student success on campus. And one of the clear examples that a faculty member told us, and we didn't know this until we had the predictive data to sort of demonstrate it. For years, math faculty knew, if you put all the math faculty together, they would say things like, a student needs Philosophy 101 before they take Calculus 201.
Wow.
Because something about Math 201 is not just numbers, it's also about reasoning,
yes,
and logic.
Yes.
And they have found that students who fail 201, when you ask them, did you take Philosophy 101 before this? And they say no. But students who do well in Math 201, you say, my gosh, what did you take last year? They always have taken Philosophy 101 before. Joed, why was this local knowledge for 10, 15 years before it was ever uttered in the presence of an academic advisor who sits down with the student and says, what classes do you want to take next semester? And never uttered in the face of an academic dean or the faculty who set requirements for a degree, because once I knew it and once the IR director knew it, we started taking the story across campus, and people would say, wait a minute, is that true? And then we had the data to demonstrate that it is, there's a pattern of achievement that is associated with taking Philosophy 101 before you take Math 201, which actually gives us what we need to make a curriculum change. Bingo. You cannot take 201 without Philosophy 101 becomes the prereq for Math 201. And now there it is, using data and sharing information and working across our disciplinary boundaries with an eye towards student success in a way that leads to decision making. And like you said earlier, transformation of the curriculum, changing the curriculum so that students are successful. If we know they need logical reasoning before they take Math 201, rather than let them guess at it or leave it to chance, let's just tell them.
Bingo. Bingo. Just kind of like cross the T and dot the I on that final piece. And that we need to, I agree. There's something about that word, about spotters, that resonates. Because if we're taking from a mindset of like it's cross pollination going on from different, everyone, and this might be kind of crazy, belonging is not just about students belonging. It's about the faculty and staff belonging enough to say, I'm going to reach across the aisle and ask about how this can help students. That's to think that the math person would have to reach across the aisle and say, hey, I heard through the study that actually philosophy is a big part of our success rate. And you have to do that. Who would have thought, right?
Right.
So that's powerful part of belonging, and it means that the spotters have to have a sense of belonging. That's the person that saved your life. Let's just say that in the workout had to feel that he belonged enough to say, I'm going to intervene here, and had the right. There's way too many people who have a sense of belonging. And they think it's belonging. No, it's what they call it's critiquing from a distance. Right. Because technically, I bet you, Terrell, someone was looking at you lift weights like, oh, look at that poor man. Oh, he's not gripping it right. Oh, right. He didn't set it right. Oh, that person didn't do jack to help you. They might have been right at a technical level, but not effective in helping you. Right. And so it's really important to, and last point too is like your health goals. Some people go to the gym to get ripped, a bad muscle. Some want to tone down. We got to ask students, what's your goals? What are your goals?
What are you trying to do?
Yes.
Build the experience, like you said, curriculum broadly conceived that will get them to that goal. The other thing is to belonging. I felt like we used it earlier in the other episode. I felt like an imposter in the gym. I had no idea. I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how long I'm supposed to run. I don't know if the goal is start slow, with running and then run faster. And then I watched a woman slow down at the end. I guess it was like a cool down period, you know.
Yeah.
And I thought about how this is the feeling. I mean, I always think about, I personally choose to spend a lot of time thinking about how my real life applies to my sort of scholarly life. And so I'm sitting there thinking, wow, I bet this is how a student feels when they're in a biology lab and they don't even know where to get started, you know?
Yep.
Some students, like you said earlier, are privileged. They grew up in high-income neighborhoods, went to well-resourced schools. They're not first generation to college. Their moms and dads had private tutors and counselors for them all their lives. So they have always been exposed to state-of-the-art microscopes and electrons and petri dishes and, you know, scientific goggles. And they walk into the lab and it's like second nature.
Yep.
There's another student who walks into the lab and they're like, oh my gosh, this is intimidating and it's scary. I've never even seen a microscope. And in my school, you know, in high school, we were so poorly resourced that they talked about microscopes. We never got to touch a microscope. Now I'm at this university and I've got to touch it. Oh my gosh, how do I get started? And that feeling of not knowing what to expect, not knowing what to do, not even, like you said, knowing what the questions are, you just feel like you are out of place.
Yes.
And the only natural response that you feel at that moment is to get away from it. I want to retreat. I don't want to be here. I should put down my, you know, in my case in the gym, put down my dumbbell or put down my weights and run home. For students, it's put down this book and either run away from this classroom to another classroom. Or the problem we really have in higher education is a lot of students have that sensation and that feeling of not belonging, and they run away from higher education altogether.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one little point. So, and I won't get lost here either because we could go on this all day, but you nailed it. You know, my research looks at student sense of belonging. I give research-based public lectures on belonging. I write journal articles on student sense of belonging. And my book, the first and the second edition, talks about student sense of belonging. But at the end of every moment I've had with an audience, at the end, the aha moment, you alluded to this in the first episode, you know, when I work with faculty and staff and I run into their mindsets and some of their resistance, when have I had those moments where I've seen some success in changing their minds is when I give a talk and at the end, a faculty member says, you know what? It is not just student sense of belonging that matters. My belonging matters.
Yes.
Or I've given a talk to student affairs professionals. I was a keynote speaker for NACA, the campus activities professionals, in Indianapolis about a year or two ago. And at the end of it, so many of them came up and said, student sense of belonging is critical. But you know what I just realized? So too is my belonging.
Yes, sir.
I can't make a student feel like they belong at an institution where I don't even feel like I matter or I belong. And it's hard for me to tell a student, you know what, you matter, people care about you, when I don't even feel like my department head cares about me or my peers care about me or my colleagues care about me. So those are those moments where I'm like, okay, we have broken ground.
Yes, sir.
We have takeoff, you know? And then the sky is the limit to where we can go once we realize, because this is what I say in the book and it's what the psychology of belonging suggests. It is sense of belonging is not a student need. It is a human need. Everybody wants to belong. Faculty want to belong, staff want to belong, grandmas want to belong, you know, parents want, everybody's yearning to matter and feel cared about. Now, I argue that it takes on heightened importance in certain contexts. And I would say when we are in places that are most different from us, most foreign to us, that are intimidating or unfamiliar, like college campuses or the chemistry lab, it takes on heightened importance. It's really, really important for me to feel a sense of belonging there because I don't know this place. I need somebody to nod and say, you recognize me, you feel me, you understand me, you're like me. And so that's true, but everybody wants to belong, including faculty and staff. And now I think the field, the space is wide open for individuals to help institutions figure out, what do we do to help faculty and staff feel like they belong? Yeah. How do we signal that they matter? And some of the things that I write about for students could work for faculty, but not all of them.
Yeah, agreed.
Group and unique set of needs that have to be met in order for those belonging needs to be satisfied.
Agreed, and that could be a segue for once you release the book coming out in spring 2018, right? The end of spring.
Right. Yes.
It'd be interesting to see how the conversation goes from belonging and how it translates to safe spaces for students and faculty and staff, but also, which I've been really interested in, maybe we can earmark this for the future episode, which I hope you can come back on for, is brave spaces. That language and the connotations surrounding brave spaces, because I think there is, a space where we have to talk about these issues and learn how to deal with them when it comes from a place of disagreement, misunderstanding. You talk about privilege language. I think higher ed is shooting itself in the foot in a lot of cases, and we have to unpack those things. So I'm just super pumped that we got to talk about this belonging, how it touched not just academic impact, but career impact, identity, and all those things combined. So it's a beautiful timing. I mean, I guess it's a God thing, I guess you could say, because I'm just diving in. I'm diving in all in on trust and the speed of trust and how that relates to belonging. And when you have a sense of belonging, you can move fast in an organization. When the sense of belonging isn't there, you're dragging people and they're kicking and screaming, or they're just bailing. So it's very helpful in multiple capacities. Dr. Terrell,
people perform optimally when they feel a sense of belonging.
Oh, yes.
And if we can connect that optimal performance in education, achievement and persistence, but like you said, in business, we're talking about community and bottom line and efficiency. Doesn't happen without people first feeling this sense of belonging. And if we can build that, I mean, to your point about trust, in the book I said that sense of belonging is a shared faith. Idea that a student says, by the way, and I'll close, anyone listening to this podcast who really is, wants more to do with this before the book comes out, Google "you belong here" and the word university, and you will get hundreds of hits, websites of colleges and universities, 2-year, 4-year, and for-profit, who use this phrase "you belong here" as a sort of call for students to come. It's on the admissions website. It's on the student clubs and organizations website. In fact, I think for the book, I did some research that over 24 universities have that phrase "you belong here" on their admissions portal. So while the student's completing their application, they look at this message that says "you belong here." Well, it gets to your point. If the student reads that message, "I belong here. People like me can fit in here. People like me can be successful there," and they complete the application, they are admitted and they enroll, it is in part built upon this trust that they have in us, that what we said on the website and what we say in the brochure, and sometimes what we say out of our mouth, is true and can happen for them. So trust, faith, community, connectedness, love, all of these are combined in this really tightly bound web that ultimately constitutes belonging. And that is what we want if we want optimal success for individuals, if we want strong and healthy communities, if we want productive and safe schools, and ultimately if we want higher education to fulfill its mission in life.
Agreed. And some will say that, especially from a mission standpoint, that putting it on a missions portal is like, oh, that's great marketing. No. That's great communication.
Right.
And I'm just super appreciative of you, because you talked about early in the episode before this that belonging is invisible. Well, you, my friend, are an educator, and a big part of the educator's job is to make what is invisible visible.
Wow.
And you've done an amazing job at that, and I really appreciate you and your work. And where can people find you, follow you, and just learn from you in this area of belonging?
Absolutely. Thank you to Joed for the opportunity to be on this podcast. Both episodes of this was fantastic. Hopefully we'll find time to do this again. I mean, what you're doing by creating a space for the voices of scholars and leaders and innovative thought leaders to come together, share their thoughts, and get it out there to a broader audience is incredible and important work. It's been great to spend time with you and to answer these questions. Anyone who would like to keep in touch and follow up should definitely visit our website at www.dogoodworkllc.org. Through our website, you can connect to all of our social media platforms. You can contact us if you would like to schedule any type of service, whether that's a speech or you're looking for a good speaker to come and talk about these issues, or if you have a more robust project that you need some consultants to come together and think about how do we do this, keep our eye on student success, and redesign and refashion our policies and programs in ways that are student-centered and success-centered and appropriately designed with cultural understandings and in ways that are equitable. We're happy to do that kind of work. You can also contact or connect with me on all things social media at TL Strayhorn. That is Terrell Lamont Strayhorn. TL Strayhorn on Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter.
Awesome. And guys, if you're listening live, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We went over time, but man, was it powerful stuff.
Thanks so much.
Catch the podcast and share it with someone. Share it with friends at work, those who are in agreement with these things. But I'm going to say one thing else too. I'm going to challenge you. If you feel that you belong or that you should belong at your institution, I'm going to ask you to be courageous in your belonging and actually act on it and share this with someone who you think might need it. And take a little risk there. And even if this could be a starting point for another discussion, for lunch and for whatever, who knows where this can go. If you share this information and use it as to set the table for other discussions, because it's truly transformative information. Penvisio.org. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Podbean, and subscribe to our newsletter if you want future announcements of future guests and also future live stream episodes. We have Dr. Swale from an institution of education coming on in a couple weeks, and we're going to talk about some of these topics, but many more in the area of over-education. Are we over-professionalizing higher ed in the sense where now it's about the staff and faculty and not so much about the students? And so what can we do about that? So there should be interesting topics there. But thanks again for everyone who's listening. Thanks again, Dr. Terrell, and looking forward to your book. And definitely we have to have you on when that comes out. So thanks so much.
All right. Take care, Joed. Continue to do good work.
Thank you so much. See you later.